I'm a professor in the writing and literature department and the graduate writing department, but recently I had a little change in job title. It's very exciting because I'm now the chair of our brand new MFA in Comics program. So let me start by asking how many folks out there, this is their first time to CCA? Because I know we've got some new faces. Yay, so welcome. We're so glad you joined us tonight and found parking. Before we start, there's a couple thank yous. I want to thank our chair of our writing department, Amy Fan, and our H&S directors, Dominic Tracy and Rachel Schreiber, and our provost, Melanie Korn, and our president, Stephen Beal. And the reason why I'm dropping all those names is because when I got here 4.5 years ago, they asked me to teach one comics workshop. And they never once asked me to defend the legitimacy of comics. They never once said, oh, I guess we'll do comics. They were like, let's do comics. And every step of the way, they've supported us, and we're here tonight kind of celebrating a whole new venture for CCA. I'm not the MC tonight, though. We've got an amazing moderator, and I just want to talk about him just for a moment here. We wouldn't have a comics program now if it weren't for him. When he came in, he brought so much energy and enthusiasm to CCA, and if any of you have had him as an instructor, you know what I'm talking about. He's a Xeric Grant winner. He's got some of the most moving comics I've ever read in his True Travel Tales. He's a Lambda nominee for Glamazonia, and his most recent work not only is great comics, but it's important. And his Fantagraphics anthology, No Straight Lines, is helping reshape how we look at comics and the history of comics. I'm really proud that he's part of our faculty. I'm really proud that he's my friend. He's an amazing cartoonist, world traveler, and part-time luchador. Our good friend, Justin Hall.
Thank you. I would get all teary-eyed, except I'm as a luchador, I'm not supposed to do that. I didn't bring my outfit, cape or mask, so you'll just have to pretend. But we're going to bring on Phil Jimenez, and I'm not really going to do any introduction because I'm just going to be asking him lots of questions for the next about a half an hour, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So. If you can think of some good questions to ask of him, he is lovely, erudite, and very knowledgeable about his own work and about the comics industry and the art form that we love so much. So please welcome Phil Jimenez. Sly. So,
do we have to lean in?
I think we're gonna go like this and then.
Okay.
All right.
Quick question: can you hear back there? Okay.
Yeah. The first question would be basically about how you got started in comics and your history with the art form and the medium. So, I know it's been a long one. So why don't you just kind of give us the rundown? Mm-hmm.
The simple version is I was born and raised in Southern California, Long Beach, and later Huntington Beach. When I was about 16, a long time ago, I realized that I didn't want to go down a more traditional career path. I had been drawing since I was 3. I had a particular knack for visual storytelling, and I got it in my head that I was going to move to New York City and draw comic books. I was going to work for DC Comics and draw Wonder Woman. I had actually not been a comic book fan when I was younger, although I was a big fan of cartoons and sort of genre shows, adventure shows. I originally wanted to be a paleontologist or work in museum exhibition and design, because that's a whole other interesting story. But ultimately, once I decided I was going to become a comic book artist and I realized I needed traditional training, I found one of only 2 schools in the country at the time that actually had a program, which is the School of Visual Arts in New York City. I applied, was accepted, attended school there for 2 years, and then was forced to leave because I couldn't afford to attend any longer. But in a fantastic twist of fate, that summer I was hired by DC Comics to do my first job. The part of that story, which I look back on and think I would never, is funny in hindsight because I wanted it so desperately, was I had been working in comics in some way or another since I was 16. And working at a comic book store, somehow it was made manifest to me. Like I came to understand that the people that I needed to know in comics to give me work were not other creators, were not pencilers or inkers or writers, they were editors. And so I had started to, and I'm still not sure what that was, but it's still true today. I realized that one editor, Karen Berger, she was in control of all the books that I read at the time. Sandman, Animal Man, Legion of Superheroes, Wonder Woman, all these things that I loved. Swamp Thing, Alan Moore's sort of seminal run, she was the editor. I met her at a convention. We became friendly, and when I moved to New York, I called her up, asked if I could come visit her, and she always says to this day, she has no idea why, but she said yes. And she would give me scripts to work from, and she would say, take the script, in 6 months call me, come back. And I would go back to my dorm room and find the calendar and count out 6 months to the day, and I would call Karen Berger. I would work on my portfolio, call her, and she would continue to see me. Ironically, she was not my first editor, but she remembered me, and we are friendly to this day. But just, I was sort of doggedly single-minded in my pursuit of this gig, and those portfolio pages that I got out of this work with her ultimately got another editor interested, and that's how I started working.
Now, you were going to Comic-Con from very early on as well, right? So you're kind of interacting with the industry in some way. Tell me about that. Like, when did you start going to Comic-Con?
So, as I said, so I am 42, and I started going to Comic-Con, I believe it was 1986, when it was still held in a small hotel. As a quick aside, I have to tell you the first time I ever saw Andy Mangels at a comic convention. It was fascinating. A little in story. But I actually have to say, don't remember the convention itself, except for they were small. It was, tables with long boxes full of old comic books in plastic bags. It was a whole new exciting world. Comic books for $1. I started finding. It was right when I started getting into comics because, as I say, I didn't grow up reading them. I got into them a little bit later in my teens. And then it just became this thing where we started to go every year because I worked for a comic book store. And so I would go with them. And then it became a ritual. Friends and I would pile into a car, go down, 9 of us in a hotel room, whatever we could afford, and then go to the convention. And because we worked for a comic store, we got badges. So that's my memory of it. And I was telling Justin earlier, I've only missed 3 Comic-Cons since I was 16. I say that not with pride. It's more with horror, really, because I realize that my entire life is sort of divided before Comic-Con and after Con. So every job I take, every trip I take, every social event, it's all about that July weekend. It used to be in August, and then it got moved up. So when people are like, "What are you doing?" Like July 23rd, can't help you. No, it's I'm a Comic-Con. So yeah.
I wanted to ask a little bit about process, since we are in an art school. So a little bit about the kind of step-by-step here. As an illustrator, what do the scripts look like that come before you? Like, is there a specific format that DC and Marvel use for these scripts? Do the scripts look different depending on whether they're from Grant Morrison or from Bill, Willingham or whomever?
Typically, in the past, there had been brought a variety of scripts. There's no standard format currently in mainstream superhero comics, and it needs to be said while I'm here in front of you. For those of you who may or may not know my work, almost the entirety of my career has spent drawing mainstream superhero comics, working for Marvel Comics, DC Comics, although I just did my first Archie work, for a variety of reasons. But my sensibilities, my business practices, my observations about the business have been shaped by a very specific career in a very specific part of a larger business. So that said, scripts used to come in a variety of different ways. There really was no format. However a writer would write, that's how the script came in. Typically, they would break stories down. In the past, you would get a plot, which was essentially a 4 or 5 page breakdown of a story in an issue, and artists were given free rein to break those stories down as they choose. And that was my skill set, not necessarily drawing, but visual storytelling, and so I always had a lot of leeway in the way I told stories sequentially. As time has gone on, writers have become more the stars of our business than artists, there's a greater influence of Hollywood. You see more and more scripts that are obviously written on screenwriting programs, Final Draft, for example. People whose sensibilities were shaped by television and film, and it changes not necessarily the format, but the language, the approach to material. Ultimately, I still personally request full plot. It's easiest to work because I am one of those people that tends to draw a lot of panels, a lot of insets, do a lot of design work, and writers think that they can write for me a 14 or 15 panel page because that's what I do, not understanding that when I've done that, it's been my choice of design, not because a writer has dictated that. But generally, that was a roundabout way to get to your question. Scripts are formatted, panel 1, page 1, establishing shot Gotham City, rainy night, etc., a piece of dialogue. Panel 2, close on a building that looks like the Chrysler Building, Batman crouched on the rooftop, cape billowing, caption. Panel 3, Batman's point of view, looks down into an alley, sees crime happening. It's really that structured. The prose itself varies from writer to writer. People like Grant Morrison and Warren Ellis are incredibly fun to read, and they write scripts to be read, not simply as comics, but by editors and artists to inspire. Other writers are very practical. They just sort of spell out what information is required on the page. There's not a lot of flourish, but generally that's how it's formatted.
You mentioned the importance of the editor in the process. So where does the editor come in at this point?
Editors, gosh, very interesting. I have had the best and worst editors in the business. Editors are a vital part of our business, and quite frankly, they are necessary evil that very few people can get around. Editors do a little bit of everything, not unlike producers in Hollywood. An editor is the person that hires you. An editor is the one that assembles a team, which means everything from the writer, penciler, inker, letterer, colorist, and at that point, what will happen is that an editor will have read a script, will have approved it. Perhaps that script will have been read by an executive editor or someone higher up. Once everyone's sort of on the same page, the script is delivered to an artist. And then the editor, depending on who they are, it's their job to provide me sort of with materials, check in with me, give me a set of deadlines, make sure I get paid when the work gets in, and essentially be there not to hover over me or hover over pencilers, but to make sure that we're doing our work. Because freelancers are not particularly known for being diligent about doing their work. We all work at home, and so we make our own schedules, and often it's an editor's job simply to prod us to continue to turn in our material.
So getting back to the step-by-step here, so you then proceed to thumbnails, to use a light box, penciling, inking. What's your process here?
My process is, I don't know if it's complex, and I don't know if it's shared. I get a script. You've heard sort of what will be described. It will either be a plot where there was no dialogue, just describing action, or it will be a more formal breakdown describing the action per panel. I tend to then work on graph paper, 8.5 by 11, in the shape of a comic, and start doing very loose thumbnails, very gestural work, just trying to figure out what the story is, often with heavy markers. So there's nothing precious about a thumbnail. I just go in, I draw it, block in shapes, solid blacks, to sort of see the graphic overall of the page, and to see how the story is going to look reduced, either in comic book form or on an iPad. Once that's done, I take that Xerox and blow it up, I think 146%, and then I lightbox it and put it on a comic board, as we call it. It's a simple piece of paper, and then I start drawing on that. As I was telling Justin earlier, if I'm really lazy, I literally just turn around to my window and put the sort of paper behind it, the Xerox, and just sort of trace from the sunlight beaming through the window. Like, I use my window as a light box often because I'm lazy, and because I get northern light. Anyway, and then once that begins, I start drawing. I would say that for me, two of the most difficult things about my process is I think a lot about storytelling, i.e. what is happening sequentially and how best to convey that information in the space given. And secondly, research and reference hunting. I'm doing a 3-page story right now that's all set in an airport, and it's all vehicles, and it's a lot of action, and it's sort of like a scene from Die Hard. Batman's in it. And it required an enormous amount of Google image searching, hunting through some books I had. I have about 1,000 books at home, because I just any sort of visual reference, like I'm sort of compulsive about buying. And then I start layering into those layouts information from the reference I've gleaned. I would say for me, the longest part of my process is that, reference hunting, research, and really considering what the overall page will look like. The rest, once I start drawing, is just labor.
Yeah. Do you ink on the same page that you do the pencils on, or?
I do when I ink, and my inker does as well. Because of the nature of our business now, because of scanning, and because of deadlines, and this is, just going to say this, most writers tend to be really, really late in our business now because most of our writers are also Hollywood people. So comics tend to be their last priority. And so often we will get scripts weeks, months late. The last job I did, the final script came in 4 weeks before the book was due to the printer. So we had to pencil, ink, color, and letter that book in about 20 some odd days. We cranked that shit out. Pardon me, I have a potty mouth. It was insane. And we were just like, and it's unfortunate because you can sort of tell, even at that point, as a quick aside, those layouts are not nearly as compelling as the first few issues of that book. Like the design work isn't as interesting. The inking is a little rougher because we were just working to get it out. And that happens a lot now in our business. Yeah, go ahead.
So now bringing in the other collaborators, the colorist and the letterer, it seems like the colorist is increasingly important. I mean, it used to not be an important part of the art, really. It was kind of flat colors that were halftone dots and all that, but now it's huge.
If you're looking at the slideshow at all, I would say 70% of the glory of any of these images is the color, which I did not do. The strength of so many of these images comes from people who are not credited in the way I am, and I think it's actually a tragic shame. When I did this book, Otherworld, in 2006 for DC Comics Vertigo, I knew how heavily dependent I was on the color design, and there are a couple pieces in here from that. And I had to fight to get the colorist's name on the cover as a credit because coloring was considered production. And if we put colorists on the cover, the thought was, well, we're gonna have to put everyone in production on the cover, and the credit list will become too long. Quite frankly, I had no problem with that, but as a policy, they skewed that. But I fought for it, got it, and sort of started this trend to get colorists on book covers because their work is so important, and more to the point, so much of what pencilers and inkers are credited for, like is really color. I always tell comic book artists, comic book fans who are like, "Oh my God, this work is so great. This is," and I try not to be a dick, to my peers, but I like showing what my work looks like in black and white and color, to say like what's so fantastic about this didn't come from me. I just gave them a framework to work in. There are many, I babble on, but there are many people in our business who underestimate the value of color, and many consumers who don't really realize that what they are awed by is not the line work, it's the color work that comes in later.
Do you think that this is going to, I mean, now that more and more comics are going on to screens and not just the printed page, are colorists becoming even more important? And how is the kind of future, the kind of technologies of comics changing the process here?
My experience is this, that color is everything, and will continue to be more and more important, partly because some of my best colorists were video game designers, and so they brought with them video game painters, so they brought with them a sensibility, a palette, and education training that had nothing to do with comics. This guy named Frank Darmada, who colored me on Astonishing X-Men, again, because Warren Ellis, I love him, but he was 6-7 months late on script. So we were just like, we would get 2 weeks to do an entire book, and then Frank would come in and color the shit out of it and make it look, and he saved us each and every issue. And he was fast and he was skilled, and I absolutely credit his work for the glory that was that particular run. Like, people really liked that run despite it being late. To your question, I think particularly because more comics will be consumed technologically, and because all that stuff is backlit, you see sort of how pretty, anyone that's looked on a comic book on an iPad or anything on a video or computer screen, it's 1,000 times more vibrant. It breathes, it lives in such a different way. I think colorists would be, I'm stopping with thought because I was just thinking about the business of comics. I think colorists are vitally important and will become more important. What's interesting to me about that is how they're cost cutting. We can talk about this in a minute. The best colorists come at cost. And I've been seeing more and more coloring outsourced to different people, different bullpens, et cetera, to start cutting costs. And it makes me wonder how it's going to affect the overall of comics. I apologize for that little sort of brain fart, but it really, I was at DC Comics last, I guess it was Monday and Tuesday, and realized that that's a very important part of our business, and they're trying to figure out how to manage it economically, and I'm hoping they make different choices.
So what about, I mean, I know that you're doing a piece right now for a Dark Knight piece that's specifically for the iPad, and how does that, format-wise, how is that different from the printed comics?
So there's this whole move in mainstream superhero comics. First off, I'm gonna interrupt. You guys having a good time? Yes. Okay. I just like to check. Because we could do this all day, and we do, but I want to make sure this is good for you.
Some kind of geek flags.
Yeah. If you're like, I don't understand what you're talking about. Yeah, we've been doing this for 2 days. Basically this. An interesting thing that's happening, the belief that most publishing will be moving onto tablets, and not simply comic books, but all sorts of publishing and kind of magazines, newspapers, et cetera. Publishers have been slow to accept this. But now that they are making format changes. And so we are provided paper by the companies to draw on. It has a lot of blue line stuff. It's got their logo on it, and then the name of the work, copyright information, so that anything drawn on that paper is copyrighted and trademarked. However, it's been reformatted so that the shapes they give us, within the various frames, can be fit on an iPad, and the artwork is going to be stacked. And it's so interesting because I'm kind of known for my design, and this really limits design because it gives you such a specific shape to work in, and what they don't want, I think because they want to control the reading experience, they don't want people to sort of move around too much, which means they really want the artwork contained in a particular space. It also limits the number of panels because you're looking at it on one size. So I might be able to do a 7-panel page. I mean, I've seen them, but they generally like you to keep them in 3 or 4 panels. The reason this matters is because if you only have 20 slides or pages to tell a story, people used to like to work with me, and I liked working this way in that if you can do 7 panels per page, 20 pages, It's like 140 panels. That's a lot of story. But if you're only doing 3 or 4, that's, you know, a third of the story ostensibly that you're getting. And the comics I was weaned on, they had a larger page count and, quite frankly, more panels. And so there was a lot of subplot, a lot of character development that often happened in those smaller areas. There's a real approach now, so many of mainstream superhero comics are built around this idea that Warner Brothers and Disney is going to transform them into some sort of film or TV show. And so there's a lot of writing towards that. And I think this format, which makes comics ultimately more readable on iPad, also has a lot to do with making them more movie and TV ready.
And from what I understand, when that same material is going to be then reproduced in print on the page, you stack the 2 pages, right? So an iPad is supposed to be read horizontally like this, and each page is like this. But then when you print it on a printed page, you stack them one and then the other. So then that stops you from being able to do a vertical panel that would stretch across the entire printed page.
Because this stuff will ultimately be reprinted, they're still thinking about the way it's going to be published. But as Justin just said, it's so fascinating because it absolutely affects, everything now is horizontal. It's not vertical. And the designing is, it's really designed to sort of mimic movie frames, that shape, because most people who now consume superhero material consume it on the big screen. And I think a part of this, creating those shapes, is to mimic the sense that you're watching a film. Because what, at least in mainstream superhero comics, they're trying to do is get all those millions of people who watch the Avengers to buy millions of copies of comic books. The trick is, reading, as you know, is a completely different experience than watching a film. And reading a comic book is even an even further different experience because there's a whole language and an art to sort of reading and receiving imagery and words at the same time. It's actually, if you don't do it naturally, it's a bit of a chore. If you've ever given a comic book to a friend and they're like, I don't know what to read first, I don't know what to look at first. It's a language, and if you don't know the language, it's very easy to toss aside. Film is a much more receptive medium. You just sort of sit and let the movie sort of watch over you and sort of cheer at the end, hopefully.
So do you, in terms of putting your futurist hat on here, do you see comic books as a language continuing into a digital age, or are we going to start seeing more hybrid forms? Are we going to start? My worry is, of course, that it would be subsumed by animation, but or are we going to start seeing hybrid forms? I know that in your Dark Knight web comic, you want to do some interactive features that you couldn't do on the printed page. Right. So at what point do these experiments become not comics, or what happens to the future of comics?
Oh God, that's such a great question. My feeling is this, that if you're going to, the material, people are going to pay money for material. I want to give them the best possible experience in whatever format that they're consuming this material. So if you're buying a comic book, I want to give you the best possible, like a pamphlet form, best possible experience in that form. The beautiful thing about, I would say, a tablet is its interactivity. So in my head, I want to design stories and take advantage of that interactivity and that sort of infinite space, ultimately, to tell stories in a different way. I personally am very excited about the possibilities for comics because I think the internet provides, again, an infinite number of opportunities to tell an infinite number of stories and have them consumed in the most basic way, in the most sophisticated or complex way. I do believe the future, quote unquote, many people think the future are these tablets. They think the future is consumption via electronic medium. I think for people to be competitive, I think they need to make the best looking comics, or the comics that look really fantastic on those tablets. It's not to say that you shouldn't think about print, but I think you should also think about how it's consumed electronically. That said, if a comic isn't meant to be interactive, it shouldn't be. I think mainstream superhero comics are constantly looking for ways to compete with film, or be seen as relevant as film, so they try to mimic things like motion, sound, all these things that comic books inherently don't have because they're a static medium. But I think what we can do, again, is create, for me, I have no desire to mimic a film, but I do like the idea that someone, and I've given this example a million times, looking at, say, a Justice League comic can click on something and see it, say they don't want to see it in color, they just want to see the black and white art, so they click on it. Now they have that option. They want to read it in Spanish, click on it, all the word balloons change to Spanish. They kind of want to know what the people in the back of the fight scene are thinking when they watch Superman fight Bizarro. Click on those people, you get a reverse slide, and you get a whole new perspective on that battle. None of that to me is about making them move, it's not about motion comics, it's not about adding sounds, but it's simply about using the interactivity to create a different kind of reading experience. And then of course the idea that because it's in the internet, you can add layers and layers. So say you do this comic, you even have a choose your own adventure aspect, so you take a particular path because you want to know, okay, so Superman fights Bizarro, and at the same time Lois Lane is, I don't know, doing whatever she's doing, and you follow that story. Ostensibly, you could always go back and just continue to add layers to that story, and it can branch out, and you can essentially, you can have this enormous tree, you have where its basic trunk is the, sort of the A story, and maybe even the B, but then all these branches that are interconnected can even interconnect to other comics. So you follow the Lois Lane story all the way to a Batwoman story, and then you follow that one back to Batwoman, and it all becomes interactive and hopefully inexpensive.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm excited about that.
Yeah. How many people here actually use tablets to consume comics? Okay. So most people still.
The future.
So most people still like their dead trees. Yeah. All right. So I wanted to move on to the actual material that you've been working with. You've been working with DC and Marvel characters for decades, and sorry to put it that way. So you're working with legacies here, and how do you approach that? Does it inspire you, or are you intimidated by it? Like how do you approach that in your head?
I'm actually not intimidated by it, and I have no interest in sort of degrading those legacies. Comic books and comic book superheroes were very important to me as a kid, and so I'm someone who really likes to honor that material when I can, and I'm always frustrated when I can't, usually because of editorial caveat or sort of larger business thing, which forces me to tell a story in a way that I don't think honors my work or honors a character, but has to, fulfills the larger needs of the company at the time. I am intimidated only in that people consume this material, they pay good money for it. I hate the idea of putting stuff out in the world that I wouldn't pay for myself. That's a really big deal for me, and it always has been. And probably what my tastes have changed, so what I'm willing to pay for now is different than maybe what I was willing to pay for when I was 25. But at the end of the day, there are people who are looking for me to tell them a story, to entertain them in their off hours, to fuel childhood nostalgia, to make them feel better, to make them think, just to make them, gasp at pretty pictures. That's my job. Like I tell stories for a living, and I take that honor very, very seriously. I think it's a really big deal. I've often said as a sort of tangent that there are 7 billion, my motto is that there are 7 billion people on the planet. They all have stories, and most of them are more interesting than anything I have to say. I just happen to have a forum and a skill set that allows me to tell stories. And again, I know what they meant to me growing up. I know how they transformed my life. I know how these fictional characters gave me sort of vision and purpose and direction. I think that I'd like the idea of passing that, paying it forward, as it were, and passing that tradition on. And I tend to be a bit of a traditionalist. Like, I don't need to see in superhero comics, for example, like Superman be an asshole and like kill children and like pull out the gun and, finally blow up Lex Luthor. Like I don't think that serves him. I don't think it serves us. But that comes from sort of a larger sort of personal, moral, ethical sensibility that might differ from yours. But I do believe characters represent, particularly the iconic characters, I think they're at their best when they represent ideas. And I know that's not always popular with writers who like characters to be real and like relatable and all that sort of jargon. but yeah, we could go on about that for hours. But my sense is that particularly the older iconic characters, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Spider-Man to some level, they represent ideas and themes, and that they are best and the most effective when they represent them well and earnestly and honestly. And I try to do that with my work. Again, mostly because people are paying for it. And I think they deserve at least that much.
Yeah. So you're kind of a custodian of these icons. I mean, essentially, you're giving them for a certain amount of time and to do things with them, and then you pass them on to the next. Yeah.
I'm a brand manager. I'm a brand manager. I really believe that when you're working with Disney, Warner Brothers, any of those sort of old classic icons, your job, they're paying you all this money to manage their brand and to not damage it. And I feel like somebody told me that, like that specifically, that's what it is. And quite frankly, I have no interest in it. I mean, I suppose there's something really wonderful and subversive about like getting in there and like really fucking up Mickey Mouse, but it's not. You know what? It's not mine, and it's. Yeah, maybe I'm just too mainstream, but I just sort of think like I'm there to take care of this thing and hopefully bring people happiness at the same time.
So when you do your own work, that's your own characters that you've created, for example, Otherworld, do you approach that in a very different creative way than you would an iconic character that you are working with, like a Wonder Woman or a...
I think, so this one project I did called Otherworld, and there's some slides in there that maybe it will show later, but it's funny that you bring that up because Otherworld had two functions, and one was utterly mercenary. I wanted a project that I owned, with characters I owned, with artwork and imagery that I owned, so that I could sell it as a movie or TV series. Number one. And I've been pursuing that for a couple of years and been talking to a couple of producers who really like it. They're trying to figure out how to manage the expense of it. It would be a very expensive show. Secondly, it was a place to explore things that I'm interested in, ethics, morality, capitalism, religion, you know, all the big ideas that sort of we all deal with every day, using these fictional worlds and fictional tropes that I use on a regular basis. Superheroes, fantasy, fictions, you know, technological science fiction, all that sort of stuff, using them as metaphors to kind of work out my own feelings and ask questions about the world that I live in and hopefully get some answers as I work through them. The funny part about this is that that particular project suffered from exactly what I didn't want it to suffer from, which is kind of what Grant Morrison's Invisibles suffered from in his first season, as it were. I don't know who's familiar with Grant Morrison's The Invisibles. I highly recommend it. It's probably one of the most incredible things I ever worked on, and certainly was life-changing just in terms of how it made me think about the world. But the book itself is about a group of anarchists who are trying to sort of destroy the controls in our world that make us do things. And The Matrix was heavily influenced by this, some of the ideas in The Invisibles. But Grant was so interested in the big ideas that he never created his characters were always secondary. They were vehicles to get to those big ideas. And I think he realized after the first arc, where sales dropped, I want to say it was 60,000 in 5 months, that people didn't care about his big ideas if they didn't have characters to piggyback through them. And it was one of the reasons they hired me, because I'm a character guy. And so I came in, I redesigned the characters, he became much more character focused, and then the book started to sell again. And I thought I had taken that lesson with me, and I don't think I did. I had a cast of characters, all of again, who represented ideas and themes and things I wanted to explore, but I got really lost in the things I wanted to explore. And I'm not sure how, I was also sort of experimenting with a writer's journey kind of thing, where every issue sort of was a chapter of the writer's journey, just because I wanted to see if it worked. But in that, for example, this is the example I always give. Gay character in that book. I remember being interviewed by several reporters in the gay press, and they were like, So tell us about the gay character. And I would say what I'm really interested in is, particularly in sort of urban areas, the cutoff. I don't want to get too much into it, but basically how I sort of felt like gay culture was being shaped by this really superficial consumerism and by skewing sort of kind of a spiritual aspect. Like it made me wonder about their connections to community and to themselves, and the very idea of what such a diverse population is. Can they be a community? That's all the stuff I was really interested in. And the gay character ends up being kind of villainous only because he's placed in a world that doesn't care about his sexuality, because there is no religion there, and so there's no shame, and so he fights vehemently to sort of keep it, even though he's kind of ends up working for the enemy, because he believes so heavily in like a world like that. And I remember, I'm hoping I was more succinct when I talked to the reporter, but I remember talking to the reporter, he's like, but does he get a boyfriend? I was like, wow. And then another reporter was like, so he kicks ass, right? And I realized that for me, those things are so part of my past. Like, I'm not even thinking about that. I'm really interested in like these sort of the larger ramifications of the sort of choices we make as a community. But for many, many people, all they want to see is, do they fall in love? You know, do they grow old together? Does maybe, you know, kicking ass is apparently very important. Like, does he beat somebody up? Like, you know, because again, these characters are often fantasy figures that we imprint on them. So.
Well, this also mirrors, I mean, what you were talking before about superheroes as being kind of manifestations of ideas and themes, but, you know, writers also want to try to approach them as kind of real, relatable characters. I mean, it's a similar...
I guess my issue, not to get too esoteric, but my problem with real and relatable in a hyper-fictional world is that I just don't believe there's any such thing. Because I think what real and relatable is like, well, I would never do that. I'm like, yes, but you don't live in a world where for 100 years, you know, people who move planets flying around in their underwear, you know, and Amazon.
I totally live there.
What? Oh, yeah, that's my, I want to earn, like, I want to win the lottery so I can make that world. But basically, it's so hyper-fictional that it's hard for me that the reality that they're trying to imprint on it, to me, just makes no sense. It's a world where teenagers run around fighting demons like on a daily basis. My sense of that, if that's your life as a teenager, you're gonna worry about different things. Like you're not like, I could be wrong, but like that's, you know, if you're trying to stop an invasion from another galaxy,
in a Speedo and elephant boots.
In a Speedo, yeah, and you can, like you have the power to do that. To like literally fly off planet and like, you know, stop a spaceship from blowing up the Empire State Building, you think about the world slightly differently. And so what's real and relatable, I understand it from a commercial standpoint, from a creative standpoint, I understand why you go there. I just don't think it's a fair version of real. Like if they were really real, it would, for example, the whole socio-political landscape of the DC Marvel universe would be different. If Magneto wanted to, he could walk into the White House and be like, dead, 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 I'm taking over. And he should, but we don't make those creative choices because that world would be almost so unrecognizable that for many people they would be limited in their investment. But my feeling is, I find that the world is so recognizable that I don't believe it, because you don't have characters like that running around and have a world that is as stable as it is. How about that?
So it's a delicate balancing act. Which characters, given that, which characters do you like working with the best? Which kind of icons and themes work best for you?
Traditionally, I like, I mean, God, my favorite characters tend to be the characters I like working with, the ones the most, that tend to promote a world that I'm interested in living in. We talked about this a little bit earlier. I find there are two types of characters in mainstream superhero comics. Not necessarily all stories are comics, but there are characters with which we relate to, i.e. Spider-Man, or like he's probably the most relatable character, and then characters with which we aspire to. And I was never interested in reading about me in a comic, because I'm like, I'm kind of boring, and I sit at home, and I don't, you know, I wanted to read about characters whose lives were bigger than mine, and who whose lives I could reach for and I could aspire to. And it's a much more narrow group of fandom, I think, than the people who really take great, I don't know if joy is the right word, but for example, revenge fantasy. Like Wolverine is probably a huge character because the fantasy of Wolverine is so appealing to such like a large number of, I think, probably disenfranchised guys who see in Wolverine like this like, kind of honorable guy, but he'll kill you if he has to. Like there's this whole weird psychology. I always said that my friend, an old roommate and I, we used to sit around and talk about this all the time. He was a big fan of the X-Men because he was a closeted gay Korean in a town of mostly straight white people, and he related urgently, just really urgently, to the X-Men metaphor of a different outsider, all that stuff. I was like, all I know is the X-Men live in New York in a mansion, and they're just really cool, and they go to outer space, and like they were like these larger than life figures, and that's what the sort of life I wanted to live. So what I related to was not the sort of metaphor of difference and prejudice, and I was just like, I want to hang out with Storm in Lincoln Center. Like that was I want to wear her boots because they're so hot, right? So again, I find that a much more narrow. Most people prefer characters that they can relate to, and I find that, for me, a takeaway of Superman and Wonder Woman in their most traditional versions is that these characters are good, and these characters are just, and they are moral. And I think they are paragons, and I think what pisses people off about them, why they find them, people are like, oh, they're so boring, they're so good, I just think they constantly remind people how much work they have to do. And I think a lot of people don't consume entertainment to be told, you could be better. You know, Superman is a good guy, and you could be like him. You know, Wonder Woman's a nice woman. You could be like her. I think we want to feel better about, you know, not being so good.
Yeah, the Amazon princess is always looking down on you a little bit. So there's some part of
and the worst part is she's not really looking down on you. She's like, you're great just the way you are. And you're like, fuck you. Like, I can't be you. And she's like, you don't have to be me. Just be the best you can be. And she's like, ah! And then you're like, here are my claws. You know, like whatever. But
revenge fan.
Right.
All right, I want to ask a few questions about teaching, actually, before we get to some questions and answers here. So you've been teaching comics and art for a while. What was your what's the history that you've had with that, and how has that affected your own art practice?
I teach at the school that I attended, the School of Visual Arts. I've been teaching life drawing for cartoonists and illustrators for about 6 or 7 years. And it's funny, my class is not a cartooning class, and I think many people who sign up for my class assume they're going to get stories like this, and that we're going to talk about nonstop about X-Men and Wonder Woman, and they're going to get to draw cartoons. And I do a high-focus drawing class. We have live models every week. Students are not allowed to cartoon. If they do, I will put an X to their drawing and make them start over. It's all about sort of Western classical representational figure drawing. It got started because Walt Simonson, who was teaching at the school, has been a friend of mine for 20 years. It was a very famous artist in our business, was leaving his position, and they were restructuring, and they asked if I wanted to teach. And I originally thought I was going to be teaching sequential storytelling, which is really my strength. And then they said, we need a drawing teacher. Would you be interested? And I had extraordinary teachers, high-focus drawing teachers, media teachers, illustration teachers in school. And so I thought, well, if I can just do what they did, I can do this gig. Uh-oh, I think I'm supposed to... Anyway, I think it's my diabetes alarm.
Please don't have an attack.
Yeah. The funny thing is, I have to I've had diabetes for a zillion years, and I still have to have an alarm just to check. So, anyway, I took this class, and basically what I did was create a lesson plan, which was an amalgam of all the wonderful lessons I had, plus an approach to the figure as a vehicle for storytelling. Being human beings are our best characters, our best ways to tell stories to other human beings. And I started teaching life drawing, and I've been doing it for years. And some of my students have gone on to great success, and some haven't. But I take great pride in that class because I work those students really hard. And I think I make them better drawers. And I've become a better drawer because a big portion of my class, a huge part of it, is about observation. My feeling being that so many cartoonists draw from here, and we need to start drawing from here. It's literally we start to need, and my class is about drawing based on observation, not drawing out of your head. And that is so hard for most of us because we were often rewarded when we were younger for being so creative. Oh, you can draw anything without looking at a picture, which is the worst lesson in the world to learn for an artist. You have to know sort of what you're drawing. You can't just make it up. And many of us also learned how to draw from comic books, which is also terrible. Don't do it.
Even your comics?
Oh, totally my comics. The worst. Like, oh, absolutely. There are things you can learn from my comics, but you should not learn how to draw human beings. You should learn how to draw human beings from drawing other human beings.
What do you feel as comics are now kind of entering an academic realm? I mean, you have programs like this, and that we've been talking about, the MFA in comics here. And you know, it's traditionally an art form that's been kind of out in the cold for a long, long time. So do you think that having comics enter the academic realm will change the industry and the art form and kind of have us think differently about it, or is that?
I pause for a minute because I've been doing academic forums at San Diego for years. Some friends of mine are academics. And as a matter of fact, about 10 years ago, gosh, maybe even more, I was part of a friend's PhD program on identity in comics. He was doing his thesis work on how we self-identify, the hierarchy of self-identification. Woman, gay, Catholic, black, whatever, like whatever you, sort of you, however you number those, affects not only the way you receive story, but how you tell story. And so I've long been interested in identity, identity politics, and comics. So it was a perfect project to be a part of. I bring this up simply because I've been a part of academia tangentially in comics for years. I'm not a historian, which is one of the things I'm really, really interested in. It's about this sort of the history of the material and how it has affected both subversively and sort of overtly population and people's perceptions, et cetera, and particularly mainstream superheroes, like when does a 2-year-old know who Superman is? Like the idea that I remember reading in some about 5 years ago that the 2 most recognizable pop culture icons in the world were Oprah Winfrey and Superman. Yeah, number 1 was Oprah, 2 was Superman. I thought that was actually, like, that to me was really, really interesting. So what I'm excited about is that people care and that people are interested not simply in making comics, but in learning the history of comics, learning the social implications of comics, learning the sort of what and who comics can reach. I will be curious. Like, it's interesting to me that San Diego Comic-Con, which I think, in order to stay nonprofit, has that whole academic, they have to host a whole number of academic panels.
It is a nonprofit. So San Diego Comic-Con, which we've talked about earlier, is this huge monstrosity, and you know, hundreds of thousands of people show up, and it is in fact a nonprofit. It's an academic nonprofit. It's educational.
And they have to. And so I've been on this Sunday afternoon, which is really hard, let me tell you, after San Diego. But I've been on this Sunday afternoon academic panels, which are always really fascinating. This is what I would say, though, about academia generally, and it's so funny knowing academics, is it's a really funny melange of incredibly sort of smart, gifted, thoughtful people and fans. And I think a lot of comic fans, and what I say is that, like, it's funny how that affects their reading of the material and, like, their observations about material and their ability to be distanced or not distanced from it. For example, there was this woman that we were talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and Joss Whedon's, and she was such a fan of that material. She was so excited about it that having any sort of objective conversation about it, good or bad, became impossible. Like, in her head, Joss Whedon could do no wrong, and she wasn't coming to this place from a as a professor. She was coming to it as a fan. So that's what's really interesting to me about these discussions is when and how we can step back from the material and sort of look at it in any sort of larger context and look at it, if not objectively, try to be neutral about it or, you know, whatever the sort of the kind of appropriate word is. But I love that people are interested in that part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, blah, blah.
So I also wanted to ask quickly about, I mean, you talked about kind of social consciousness in the industry, and you've been one of the kind of most prominent openly gay creators in the comics industry. The comics industry has changed quite dramatically over the last number of years, and how can you just talk a little bit about that and how you've watched it change?
You mean change in what capacity?
In terms of diversity, both creators, fans, openness to diversity within of characters and such.
These are my observations, and so they need to be recorded as such. I'm totally a career gay, for one. Like, I have a career, and I think I have a following, and because I came out really early, and I take great pride in sort of being an openly gay artist. And I was amazed at the Gays in Comics panel we did at San Diego when there was that chronology of, you know, gays in comics. I was fairly early up, and I didn't really connect with that where I was in the sort of grander history. And I'm one of those people that absolutely believes my identity shapes my creative choices. Like, because I believe that we navigate the world. Like, when I say, like, I'm a gay artist, as opposed to just an artist, I don't think I'm just an artist, because the artist describes something other than what I am, and I am an other. And being born and raised a certain way, with a certain language, in a certain environment, you navigate the world that way. And I'm absolutely a reflection of being a young gay kid raised in Southern California at a particular time. My sensibilities, everything I'm interested in, it's all about that. And so I'm proud of it. I really like it. When it comes to diversity in the industry, I grew up at DC Comics. My first boyfriend was the man that hired me, who passed away, actually had AIDS, and it was really fascinating because I came out when people realized that I was not only his caretaker, but his boyfriend, and it really changed the way people thought about gay people and AIDS, etc., at DC Comics. You know, at the time, I was just taking care of this guy that I loved. It didn't occur to me that there would be like a seismic shift in the offices. So the 90s at DC Comics, where I grew up, were incredibly diverse. I'm not sure we made great comics, it needs to be said. But in terms of editorial staff, creators, we were in New York City, ethnically, racially, and sexually diverse group. We were young, we were so excited to be working in comics. It was amazing. And we were working like sort of at the tail end of the comics boom. But the leader, and we had a leader in Jeanette Kahn, who was also very, very keen on promoting diversity and difference, et cetera. Ultimately, what happened is, I think a couple things. Neil died, my boyfriend died, and another man, Archie Goodwin, very famous writer, editor in our business, died. And that vacuum was filled by older white guys who absolutely started shaping the aesthetic of the business and what creative choices could be made, what they were comfortable with, language, character development. It was so fascinating how just the death of a couple people, and Archie wasn't gay, but he was just a super progressive thinker about the material, totally changed everything. And then this guy who was kind of an old school meat and potatoes, dude from Brooklyn, he was in charge of everything. He was in charge of the vision of this company, which he didn't necessarily have. Jeanette Kahn ultimately got left, and another man replaced her who did not have, her degree of social consciousness or interest in exploiting it through these characters. As comics started to implode again, and again leadership shifted and changed, my sense was that the industry got more conservative, and they were less interested in diverse voices than voices that would sell. And our all entertainment niched, so did American superhero comics. So they became more and more targeted to their primary consumer, which was white, college-educated men aged 25 to 40. Some college, I should say. And that's an actual statistic from a couple years ago. And so they just started targeting those people. And then those creators, as fans became creators, they started speaking to themselves, and it became this sort of vicious cycle. My experience now is that there is some interest in diversity, but it's an industry desperate to stay alive in a contracting economy. And so diversity comes not because there are a bunch of young kids trying to just be like, yeah, let's put some Puerto Rican gay guy in there. It comes from a sort of calculated thing, like if we get a gay character, we can get that in the news and that will sell units. And so it just comes from diversity comes from a different place. I'm not necessarily sure the end result is bad, because as long as representation is there, it's there, and comics are a business, they need to make money. But I feel like it comes from a different place, and therefore it's manufactured and generated differently. And so I will be really curious. Also, the other thing, if I can just say for diversity, brands generally take a fairly long time to take hold in the public consciousness. Very rarely do you get an instant overnight brand. Sometimes you do. It's rare. And so it's often very hard to introduce in mainstream superhero comics again a black character, an openly gay character, sometimes even a woman character, unless they fit in a very narrow niche, that is so familiar to a consumer that they're willing to invest in it. It's why one of the reasons I actually think the idea of making a Green Lantern gay is smart, because it's an established franchise with an established name. It's easier to sort of a character in, or making a name brand that people know, like into a new version of a character. Like I loved, and it blows my mind this sort of kind of vitriolic, kind of racist response to the Hispanic Spider-Man, because it wasn't the same character. It was a new character in the new mask, and I'm like, that's perfect, because if there's any character in comics that's like anybody could be it, it's because it's a full body costume. It doesn't matter what he looks like underneath, particularly for kids. Like it's great. And I was like, well, Spider-Man can't be that. And I'm like, of course he can. He's not real. He can be anything we make him.
That doesn't leave this room.
Right. I hate to tell you. And certainly I have my own feelings about characters and the way they should be portrayed, but invariably it has to do with tone and theme, not what they look like, not what their gender is, or what their sexuality is.
All right, I'd like to open it up here to some questions from the audience. Sorry that we've babbled for quite a while here, so thank you for sticking with us. So any particular questions?
Yeah, can you tell me the difference between like an artist and an inker and all the rest of the titles that I see in comics? I have no idea what they do.
Can people hear the questions, or should I repeat them? People hear them? Okay, all right.
So the hierarchy is this. A writer, a script writer, literally just writes a script. And I say just, it's probably a little dismissive. But as someone who's been working on the art side of comics for a long time, I realize that a lot of what artists do, a lot of what is attributed to writers, for example, comes from art. Not always, but certainly I've read over and over on the internet, like, oh, I really loved it when on a project I'm working on when a writer did this. I'm like, that was my choice. I did that. That's just a total aside. But essentially, that's why I said just. Writers create a script. They actually create this sort of narrative, and they write the balloons, often in sort of screenplay form. A penciler, which is what I do, draws comic pages, usually large, in pencil. And this has been the tradition now for 60 years, if not. There are levels of this. It's like layouts, breakdowns, full pencils. Depending on the complexity and the tightness of the pencils, they're considered different things. But essentially, the base is done in pencil. So all the drawing work I do is still pencil on paper. An inker comes in afterwards and traces over those pencils with India ink, embellishing the lines, creating black line weight, filling in black spaces, essentially to make them scannable and reproducible. Anyone that looks at comics knows that a really good inker can save really bad pencils, and a really bad inker can really mess up great pencils. I've been lucky that I've been working with an inker named Andy Lanning for years, and we are just simpatico. He gets me, he knows what to bring out in my work. It's not just a matter of tracing, again, it's a matter of embellishing, about really pulling out the good stuff, leaving behind the bad. Because what a penciler does is creates a really solid framework, and then the inker comes in, inks it, cleans it up. Once that happens, that artwork called a board is scanned, and then that scan of black and white work is sent to a colorist, and the coloring is done usually on Photoshop. Certainly now. The coloring in the old days is amazing. It used to be done by hand, and there are still hand guides. My colorist on Wonder Woman did all these beautiful watercolor guides, and those were sent to the printers who invariably, I forget how they actually put the color in via computer, but never did justice to them. A shift in our business was seeing colorists who traditionally worked in those watercolors or markers or pens having to very quickly learn Photoshop to catch up, because they're called separations. There's a color, like when you're actually putting the color in Photoshop, it's called color separations. I'm not sure where the term comes from. And actually there's a step before that called flatting, where just blocks of color are put in. Colorists often hire flatters to do that because it's really sort of tedious work, but it allows colors in Photoshop to pick up, rather than have to lay in the color themselves, they can just go in and start, like if there's a whole area of orange, like just orange flatting, then they can click on that and turn it into a starry sky or whatever they need to do. It's a basic work. So you have a writer who writes a script, a penciler who draws the full pages in pencil, giving the detail, the storytelling, determines the sequential narrative, etc. The inker traces over those pencils in India ink or marker, anything that can make them reproducible. That work is then scanned and sent to a colorist, is flatted, and then colored in Photoshop. The lettering, the balloons, are now all done. It used to be done by hand. It actually used to be this extraordinary art. But at some point, the art collectors market decided they didn't want to see the lettering on the bards. They just wanted the art. So the lettering was removed, and now it's done almost exclusively on computer. And so the fonts are mimics of original hand lettering, which again, all comic lettering used to be done by hand, and then they're just put in by someone in production. Does that make sense? Does that order make sense? So the artists on comics, there are 4 at least. Penciler, inker, colorist, letterer.
Another young lady?
You made a lot of good points in talking about how, you know,
I did?
Oh, butter him up.
Right. What are you doing for dinner later?
I'm very interested in how you're talking about how you view these superheroes as icons, how, you know, as superheroes, they think so much more differently than regular people. Like, they're thinking more about the state of the world rather than their own personal problems. And so with this thing, I've read a lot of like fan input, what they've thought about this certain thing. So as a person who has worked with Wonder Woman and has worked with mainstream comics for a while, what do you think of Superman and Wonder Woman?
Oh, God. I have a couple of answers to that. The Superman and Wonder Woman that are in this, became this news event, are fairly new incarnations of those characters. And that incarnation of Wonder Woman doesn't appeal to me at all, mostly for tonal reasons and for sort of feminist political reasons. So I don't really care. Secondly, it's not new. They've trotted this out before. Usually it doesn't last all that long. But the Superman-Wonder Woman coupling has been kind of a constant theme in comics since at least the early 80s. So when everyone was like, oh my God, Superman and Wonder Woman are getting together, my thought was, again? They're trying it again? What's interesting to me about it, also like reading the scene up to it, yeah, I could go on for a long time. I'm not going to. Generally, my feeling is that I'm not all that invested in those incarnations of those characters, so I don't particularly care. I know a lot of people are I have a comic reading fan who's absolutely devastated because for him, and he's a straight guy who loves Wonder Woman, the Steve Trevor character, her former boyfriend, was a vital entry point into her world. And this hope that, like, and again, it's a really interesting thing, which I don't have, but he does, where, like, one day he can meet his Wonder Woman. Like, he can meet someone as amazing as she is, and she could fall in love with him. Like, that fantasy is very important, but instead she goes for, like, the football jock who has everything. And I think he just is just, like, he just hates that message. And so I'm just fascinated by that.
Can I just make one aside, though, that I do think Wonder Woman used to give Steve Trevor, traditionally, the best blow-off line ever, which was, Steve Trevor would be holding her and be like, Wonder Woman, we're in love. Let's, finally get married. It's time. And she would go, absolutely, Steve, I would love to. As soon as there's no more crime and injustice in the world. Best blow-off line ever. We'll totally get married as soon as there's no more crime and injustice.
Right. Yeah. Which will be next Thursday.
Yeah. Right. She works at Super Speed.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So another question.
Okay. So in Asia, there's Japanese comics is a huge industry too, and it's getting very popular here. Like in Comic-Con, there's cosplayers and there's artists. So what do you think about the two different cultures? Let's say Western comic and Japanese comic, how they influencing each other, and what do you see the trend?
I have to say, admittedly, I see far more Japanese comic influence in American. I don't know enough about Japanese comics printed in Japan to know how much the American influences aesthetically or thematically. I know that as a drawing teacher, what makes me crazy is that many people who are fans of Japanese comics study it in only the most cursory, surfacey way. So when they come to a drawing class and they are drawing in a particular style, for example, for lack of a better word, I realize how little they actually know about what it is they're copying. They just look at shapes, I think, that they think are easy to mimic or appealing to them, and when they bring it to them, I realize it's like my favorite manga is this. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he drew Crying Freeman. And to me, that is the most amazing amalgam of Eastern and Western comic book tradition ever, because it's still kind of Western-y and representational in its approach, but it's stylistically, thematically, even in terms of aesthetic and ink work, it's utterly Asian. And I just like, if I could draw like him, I don't know if I'd give my left arm, but I would do a lot. And I would love to see more of that kind of hybrid. I just know from my experience, I tend to see the heavier influence in Americans and without a lot of understanding of what's actually happening underneath. That said, what I do find appealing and exciting is how it shapes design aesthetics. Because I think the thing that is horrifying about American superhero comics, particularly DC, is the design aesthetic, which is about 20 years old. And it's awful. And what's wonderful is that whenever you can draw influences from anywhere else and reshape the way you approach design, I think that's extraordinary. And there's some beautiful stuff that sort of comes in, particularly from Japanese comics, that I'm like, that is amazing. Like that's the future, like, to me, of design. But I babble on. I don't know what the influence of American material is on Japan, the way that I see the influence in the reverse.
There is that term decompressed storytelling, where American comics are using some of the language of Japanese comics to kind of do fewer panels, be more cognizant about pacing and stuff like that. It's a new trend.
At least in American superhero comics, so I think that's an economic one. I don't think it's like, oh, this is a really wise way to tell comics. I think decompressed storytelling means we can get 6 issues out of this instead of 5. And therefore, we can get an extra $3.99. I don't mean that. Not to be bitter or cynical, which I am, but not to be that. If there's anything that's really happened that I've noticed is that a lot of, whenever you go, why is this happening? Two answers. One, because somebody thought it was a good idea, but most likely because someone thought they could make money from it.
Another question.
So speaking of branding and decompressed storytelling and shared universes, so it feels like DC really is, like there's this kind of sense of desperation. The industry is dying, it's just shrinking. So they make this big explosion, and there's a continuity to work in now. What is continuity from a creator's perspective? Like the fans are piecing it all together, trying to create a history. What is it on?
Do you mean the New 52 or generally?
Generally, and is there a difference before and after?
I think it depends on who you speak to. I approach continuity not from a sort of sense of like nostalgia, like, oh my God, I loved X-Men 467 and now it's out of continuity and like I just can't handle it. Like I don't really give a shit. It's this, the specifics matter only in the way they serve character to me. I just don't believe that you can remove, like, human beings are products of their history. This is just a personal belief. I'm certainly a product of my history. And if you were to suddenly remove a huge chunk of that, I would not be who I am today. That's how I view the world. We are who we are because of the experiences that we have. So for me, continuity is not simply a matter of making sure every issue remains intact, but it's making sure that characters thematically, tonally make sense and that major events take place. Continuity is also, these characters exist and thrive in much the same way soap opera characters did because of long-term investment. We are there with them, we are there with their stories, good and bad, we live through, you know, that's a part of our fandom. We remember when these characters went through really good things, when they fell in love, when they fought a particular villain, sometimes when they died, when they came back. And if you remove something so vital, it changes that character and it changes their relationship and changes their investment. At least it does me. So for me, continuity, and I'm a continuity hound, but again, from a, not because I think every issue needs to matter, but because I think the characters that I love because of this sort of this longer arc, this longer sense of narrative. I was having continuity conversations with a couple people doing research about some old Teen Titans stuff, and specifically chronology, because I also think, so for me, it comes to this, character, and you may or may not agree, we are who we are at certain ages. Like, I'm a big fan of continuity and of tracking how old characters were, and character for me is all about, like, I care about how tall characters are, I care about how old they are, I care about how they stand. I'm very well known in the business for giving certain characters body language and for different body types. And I think if you are short, you talk to tall people differently than if you're tall and you talk to short people. I think where you come from, again, the language that you use to process information, all that stuff shapes who you are and therefore shapes character. Continuity to me, oh God, now I lost my train of thought, but it's all a part of that. And for me, like, how old a character is or where they are matters because it will shape the way I approach them in a story. Like, I'm a teenager, like my friends who have teenagers or like young teenagers, I think about that when I'm writing a character. My hope is that I wouldn't write teenage Robin the same as I would 25-year-old Nightwing. They're different because their body experiences are different, because kids are different than adults. So for me, continuity is all about tracking that sort of stuff. Again, less about specifics, but really believing, but believing that we are products of our histories, and that history matters, and that your investment, your time, your money matters. And to say, like, wipe out whole swaths of things and say, fuck you, it didn't matter, just seems rude. And here's the thing I think is crazy, is the number of fans who are like, I don't care. Like, they still clamor for it. Like, I'm boggled by that because I find that fuck you makes me not care, and like, you can have it. But people that are invested are really, truly invested. Yes?
You were talking about the tablet and, you know, having like individual comics like, you know, on that and that being a possible future. But we also have that format of like, you know, like in the graphic novel section, there's digests of, you know, 6 or 7 issues. Do you think that's a more popular thing than the individual issue?
Oh, you mean like trade paperbacks?
Yeah.
Oh, I remember again, I used the term 5 years ago. It might have been longer or shorter, but it was a few years ago when I think a third of DC's money came from trade paperback sales. And when they opened up the trade paperback market in Canada, we all made crazy money in royalties that year. I mean, it was extraordinary. People love having the entire story. I think it's easier for non-comic fans to pick up a trade paperback which reprints a story from beginning to end than it is for a regular comic consumer who's used to longer-term narrative, waiting for a month, the cliffhangers. Many consumers just aren't that patient. So I think trade paperbacks for a long time sold really, really well. I don't know if they're doing as well now. I also think there's just so many of them, and they're not special. Like, they don't just reprint special stories, they reprint all stories. So I don't have the numbers, but there was a period of time not too long ago when they sold like hotcakes. And they were really easy. It was a really easy way to give non-comic readers a complete story and not have to ask them to come back, next week for the next one. I was just thinking, I don't have the numbers to tell you, but I think they're an important part of the business.
Okay. There's different publishing companies that do different things, and I was wondering what the pros and cons were for like self-publishing or a publishing company that gets all the copyrights versus a publishing company that takes a fraction of the profits.
I will try to answer this the best I know. I often say the only reason you ever want to work for a mainstream superhero company is because you have a desperate desire to work with a character that you love, i.e. Spider-Man or Captain America. Like, that is a driving force in you, especially because now the industry is changing even more. They are getting rid of exclusive contracts. They're not giving bonuses. They're getting rid of insurance. All these other business benefits that made it a wise choice to work for these companies, they're eliminating. So the only carrot they have to dangle in front of us is often a really good page rate, reprints and royalties, and a nostalgic love for a particular character. To most of my students, I absolutely encourage them, unless they absolutely must work for a mainstream company. And there are benefits, trust me. There's travel, there's money, there's good stuff that comes in that, but you will never own that material. You will always be brand managing for someone else. You will always be giving up your ideas to someone else, and they will own them the minute you go on the page. Again, for some people, that's totally fine. They earn a living, they support their family, they travel, they get all the perks. But I absolutely encourage ownership, and I absolutely encourage young people to think about other venues for their work and to really be careful of deals. Contractual deals. Many companies in the fine print look to control. So say you go to an independent company, it seems great. They're willing to publish your work. All they want are the publishing rights, and then you get the media rights, i.e. video games or television or whatever. And then they, however the deal works. Well, publishing is really interesting because publishing can mean anything that's published on the internet. Like, you have to be very, very specific about the language, about what they own and what they don't. Are you just talking about print publishing? Are you talking about anything that ends up on Wikipedia, anything that ends up on a website? If you generate anything while you're working for them, even if it's at home, do they own it? Like, what are the rules about that? I believe that people should really think about independence, and I think they should figure out ways to sort of own their own material. I think it's absolutely the way to go. Also being aware that you might have to have a second job, that it might not be instant wealth unless you have that Walking Dead 2 that AMC wants to turn into a TV series. You might be generating for a smaller audience. You might not be making as much money as if you were drawing the Justice League. But the fact that you own it, that you can sell it, that you can take it elsewhere, you can develop it, or you can keep it and hoard it and never give it out to anyone, I think that's actually a wonderful thing. The thing I always tell anyone who wants to write and draw comics is that you have a lot of competition. And the question I ask my students is, you are asking people to spend money on your work. What are you saying? What are you saying that is different or exciting enough that makes you competitive, that makes someone say, well, I've got $3 to spend on this comic here, which has Batman and the Court of Owls, and that shit's kind of cool, or I can spend $3 on you. I don't know you, I don't know your work, I don't know its content. So I just always think I ask people to be really honest about what they are bringing, what stories they're selling, and why on earth someone should pay for your work as opposed to work they already know. And there are a million reasons they should, but I think they have to be clear in your head. Does that help you at all? Okay, does that help anyone? Okay. You.
Yeah. So you've been behind the genesis of some non-creator-owned characters, and I was just wondering if you could talk about that experience. And like, so Rob Liefeld, he got kind of pissed when Peter David made Shatterstar buy. Did anyone call you during Blackest Night to be like, yo, we're killing Tempest?
Oh no, they wanted to kill Tempest forever. The problem with Tempest as a character, and the problem with Donna Troy as a character, is Tempest is one of those good, not badass characters. He's an incredibly powerful character who isn't really interested in kicking your ass because he's not an angry character. And it was amazing how the minute I gave him up, they tried in every way to contort him to make him something that he wasn't. The worst I remember, it just killed me, when they married him off. So for those of you who don't know, he's been up on the screen. There's a character named Tempest. He used to be Aquaman's sidekick. I grew him up, and at the time it was a really sort of popular miniseries that came out in it. I always say it's my favorite work I've ever done. It's the most pure, intuitive work I've ever done. And it's old, but it was the least edited I've ever been, in that the editor he fixed grammar, he checked for story structure, he didn't completely rewrite whole blocks of dialogue, didn't make me change the narrative. I would say that if you like that story, hate that story, it's my fault. And there are very few other things I've ever worked on where I can say that. Invariably, the stuff I'm most troubled by is stuff where editors came in and just really, mucked it up. With Tempest was a character who, again, fairly gentle soul. His girlfriend had died. My story was about him getting over that, moving on, getting this new identity, and he got a whole bunch of new powers. And he was a sweet guy. And in a universe full of not so many sweet guys, and they tried instantly to make him not sweet. And because they couldn't, because that's sort of antithetical to that character's nature, they were like, we got to get rid of this guy. They just hated him, and so they were always plotting to kill him. And so when they killed it, he's not mine, so they can do whatever they want to. But going back to what I hated was they gave him a wife and a kid, which was so terrible. And I remember asking the editor about that, and he goes, well, I don't know if he's the right character to do it with, but I want to see a happy family in comics, and he's the character that we have to do it with. Oh, okay, so it doesn't make sense, but that's what you're going to do. And so a pitch that I had for a follow-up to that was sort of tossed aside, and that's just the way it goes. And you just sort of, your heart breaks a little bit, and then you have to let go. And that was a character that I had to let go, which is kind of sad.
Oh my God.
So, because you work at home, right? And
I
I'm sure
do.
a lot of
I watch The View every day. Oh, yeah. I scream at Elizabeth Hasselbeck, shut up! Shut up! Not really.
How often do you actually meet the artists, the editors, face to face?
I live in New York City, so I meet them a lot. One of the reasons I moved to New York City was so I could be close to those offices. And I found when I was getting work, it was very helpful to be in their faces. I have relationships with them now, so it's less vital. But like, for example, I just went to Hasbro a few weeks ago to talk to the Transformers people to do some stuff. And I actually took the train to Rhode Island, talked to them, and just being in that room for 2 days, so helpful. I highly recommend wherever, if you're pursuing a career with, say, in mainstream comics or with a big company, if you can be where they are and talk to them even for a day, it's so, so helpful because you can have a relationship, you can bond with them. It's not simply over the phone or via email. It helped me immeasurably. And socially, I had, like I was saying, in the 90s, all my best friends were editors. I actually don't have that many friends who are talent, i.e., creators. Most of my friends in the business are administrators, are editors, the people that don't get as much notice, just because they were in the offices and I liked them, and they were sort of fun and cool.
I asked that question because I was wondering why the like, gender kind of thing, where only a very small fraction are female artists in the specific comic industry. Like, your opinion on it, or is it just,
On why that happens? Is it what?
Is it coincidence, or is there
Nothing's coincidence.
like
No, there are all sorts of reasons for that. My take on it is a couple. Comics is a boys' club. It has been. Like, part of it's the target audience. Comics are certainly now proudly targeted towards white guys of a certain age because they can be relied on to consume the work. It's sort of this weird mix, like messy froth of sort of race and gender and money. It's gross, but like that's sort of what it is. There's no great financial incentive to target women because women are not buying comics in droves. And it becomes a circular argument. Like, do you make comics for women? And then you talk about what kind of women. Do you make comics for fangirls, or do you make comics for girls that would never read comics? Like, how do you get them? Distribution becomes an issue. Also, people tend to, comics like entertainment generally, but comics are a small industry. Really, there's a lot of nepotism. You hire your friends because you can count on them. Your friends are often like you. Girls are icky. It's like this whole, and I say that tragically only half joking. Like, there's this weird sense like, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, nothing makes me crazier than girls who are like, oh, I don't want to be known as a woman writer, I just want to be known as a writer, which essentially means you want to be known as one of the guys. And I can think of nothing that makes you not interesting at all. Like, what makes you interesting is the fact that you're not one of the guys, because there are a lot of guys writing comics. What makes you interesting to me is that you're a woman and that you bring an entirely different viewpoint, perspective, way of being raised, way of navigating the world to that work. And if you write really awesome, compelling stories, that makes it even better to me. Like, that's why I encourage and love diversity, because nobody sees the world the same way, and I want that. I don't want someone who just does the same work that anyone else has. They just happen to have breasts. Like, for people who say that, I think it's a very, very politically savvy way of getting work, because you're not seen as the other, you're not seen as different. If you're one of the guys, you're not seen as threatening. If you do what the guys do, it's still, well, she's a girl, but she's cool. There's always that but in there, as opposed to she's a girl and she's cool. And that I find incredibly troubling. So I think, again, I think part of it has to do with who you're targeting, consumer base. I think it has to do with who works in the industry. I will say that at least DC Comics, the LA branch, enormous number of women working behind the scenes in product design, licensing, legal, all that stuff. It's not a company devoid of women. It's particularly in publishing, the superhero publishing part, that's where there are a few women. There are tons of women in comics, and some really amazing ones, but they are working, it seems like, in a different division, maybe because that's where they're more accepted.
A frothy mess of race, gender, and money.
Right.
It's
like Centaur.
It's like a Centaur, the comic Centaur.
Yeah, the comic Centaur.
Okay. What? Look it up, people. Look it up. Google it. In the corner there.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about some of the lessons some of the approaches in the classroom that you take with your students. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe some of the essential traits and things that an artist would need if they were interested in working in comics?
Repeat that. I didn't hear the last part of the question.
Yeah, just maybe talk a little bit more about essential traits that an artist would need, or maybe lessons that you would sort of give in addition to classically, drawing a figure.
So as a lead into that, I was really fortunate last night. I was at ILM and I was doing a guest teaching spot for 3 hours, a drawing lesson for their for all their departments. About 20 some odd artists came, different skill sets, etc. But
Industrial Light and Magic.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I thought you all knew what that was. I gave a super condensed version of my class, and there were several. I wish I had the list, but there were about 10 things that I said you should always remember. The first is that human beings are great storytelling. Human beings are your best storytelling tools. We relate to other human beings, so always think about that. Human beings as sort of as character. God, when it comes so practically, always think about proportion and structure, understructure. Think about things like things as basic as line weight can convey enormous amounts of information about things like gender. I would not use the same line weight to draw a certain kind of woman that I would a certain kind of man. Is this the sort of stuff you're looking for? Like tips, basically, like how to draw, like drawing tips. A huge part of my class is dedicated, I could show you. I call it the Tyra Banks School of Acting. Everything I learned to draw, I learned from Tyra Banks. And it really is quite simple. That if you've ever watched America's Next Top Model, or if you know anything about modeling, you know that you can either model like this, or you can model like this. That's my joke, but it's sort of true. That what you're always looking, because sometimes you only have a single image to convey a story, you always want to go bigger, you always want to go broader. In my drawing classes, I'm very, very keen on emphasizing certain aspects, particularly contrapposto, height differentials between shoulders, distance between chin, like the direction of their gaze, all that sort of stuff, because it's character, it tells about character, but mostly it conveys information quickly. So if I was to draw, if I'm drawing someone sad, for example, I'm not just going to draw them like this, I'm going to draw them like this. Like sort of big, broad emotion, particularly in comics. Simply, again, it's a quick way of conveying drama or story. What else? There's so much that we could go over. I highly believe that all comic artists should never look at comics again when they are learning how to draw. I think they should only draw from life. I think they should only draw using their eyes. A huge part of my lessons are getting people to draw based on observation. If I see your head down for too long, I will make you stop and look up and make you, because so many people, they'll start and then they just get really into it, and what they're into is sort of kind of the process, but they're not using their eyes. Another very important lesson to me is that I don't care how you draw, I don't care what medium you use. If you draw one line or 1,000, doesn't really matter. What matters is that each line, each mark you make is a deliberate choice, that you are not faking your way through the drawing, that you're not hoping one of those lines or marks is the correct one, that you approach the drawing fearlessly and with commitment, and that you put those lines down. And again, it can be a single swooping line, or it can be a line with 1,000 sort of cross-hatched marks, but they have to come from a place of confidence, commitment, and deliberate choice, that you don't etch your way through a drawing and pray to God that one of the marks is correct. That's a big sort of lesson. The other thing, I like, basic things like negative space and always being a stance is huge in my class. How we stand says an enormous amount about us. And finally, and I was, because I'm trying to remember what we went over. Always. Your figures tell stories. Anything you draw is like, we're all here on some level to tell stories. So if your model's sitting there like this, and that's what you have to draw, don't just approach it as a sort of academic exercise, approach it as a storytelling one. Who is that guy? Who is that woman? Why is she sitting like that? What is the story? Because the choices you make in terms of mark making will probably be different. Like if, bored, you might get more of a slump out of it. Sad, you might sort of emphasize the drawn-in shoulders. sleeping, you might you might pull this shoulder back and get a totally different action. Figure out what the story is that you're telling, even in a basic academic drawing. It will actually help you make emphasis choices and tell a story even through the most basic academic drawing. Finally, one last thing. Sorry, it's all coming to me. Shut up. It's all coming to me. Wait. For every good drawing, you're going to make 100 bad drawings. And the thing is, you just have to know that. So you have to be willing to work through the bad drawings, take the lessons from them, and move on. Many, many cartoonists particularly are very precious about their work. And I know in my class, I'm like, you can be as precious as you fucking want, but if it's a bad drawing, I'm going to put an X through it and you're going to start over because it's no good. It does, and because hopefully you've learned the lesson that you needed to from that bad drawing. Nothing makes me crazier than the intense amount of work that cartoonists put into sort of surface details, cross-hatching, whatever, when the understructure, the undercarriage of the drawing is poor. I'm like, it does you no good. It's a lot of work and a lot of heart invested in the wrong place and the wrong time. So know that you're going to make bad drawings. Don't get them out of your system. That's why you're here in school, so that your portfolio and that the work you do professionally is as awesome as it can possibly be.
That is one hard-ass teacher. All right, this is the end of it. Thank you so much, Phil. Thank you guys for coming. It's been a long lecture, so thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, good.